I'm sitting here with the Australian Greens Senator Rachel Siewert, spokesperson for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues, and Family, Ageing, Community and Disability Services.
Hi everybody, it's a real pleasure to join you tonight. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but hopefully my contribution will help your discussions.
So I'll start with the first question. What role can all levels of government play in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals?
All levels of government are essential if we are going to meet the global goals. Local government makes some of those decisions that are so close to people's everyday living and provide some of those essential services. State government obviously make very important decisions that govern people's lives and that touch the global goals, and of course the federal government does, whether it's through the provision of actual services, but they set a lot of the overall policy, and they also need to be showing leadership in if we are going to reach these goals.
What can civil society and private enterprise do to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
I'll probably come back to this issue a lot, but civil society is critical. I've always taken the position that it's civil society that leads discussion, that leads government. Government then picks up issues, and as I said earlier, the federal government needs to be showing leadership in terms of policy setting, but civil society is critical in getting government to pick up these ideas. So without civil society, it's my opinion that we simply will not reach the goals.
And how can we ensure that all Australians are accurately supported through our achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure that no one is left behind?
Well, this is where it's absolutely critical that we start looking at what are the issues that we need to address if we are going to achieve the goals. How are we going to address issues about ending poverty? And to me that then means, how do we start addressing things like those underlying causes of disadvantage, the underlying causes of poverty, address the very real issues around inequality, which is growing in Australia but growing across the planet. We need to be addressing those sorts of issues. So we need to look at what are the policies, the systems, the programs that are actually going to start addressing these underlying causes. So for example, let's look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the most disadvantaged groups in Australia, and we know about the huge issues around incarceration in terms of the growing numbers of incarceration, the burden of disease, the campaign to close the gap. Unless we start addressing some of those underlying causes of disadvantage, why are Aboriginal young people, for example, more interacting with the justice system? Why do they end up disproportionately represented in the justice system? Now, there's a lot of work being done in that space, but government's not taking it on board. So, for example, we know that early intervention and prevention will actually result in much better life outcomes. We know, for example, from Fiona Stanley's work that shows the success of early intervention and prevention programs. So why isn't that being taken up? Why aren't we addressing and investing in the front end instead of picking up the pieces afterwards? Out-of-home care, we saw dramatic examples of the failures of the system last night in Four Corners. Again, we know that investing early on will keep kids out of home care and have better life outcomes. Yet government invests, same as in incarceration, is the same in the out-of-home care system. We invest once we reach a crisis, not in supporting families and young people before the crisis. We need to reverse our priorities there. And that's why we need campaigns to drive change. Go back to the requirements, the absolute need for civil society, because without civil society we're not going to get those drivers from outside the system for change.
Our initial results show that women are considered to be the second least marginalised group, although ABS statistics show that there remain issues aggregated by gender, including pay and family violence. How do we overcome the perception that we have successfully achieved gender equality?
That's a huge issue that a number of groups are tackling, but you only have to look at the statistics to realise that women are still far behind in the pay gap. The gender pay gap is still huge, and we know from family violence, and we've had a campaign, thank goodness, going in Australia for a while now, and it's been going very strongly over the last couple of years. and yet we are still seeing appalling family violence and domestic violence figures. So I think we need to be, again, highlighting those areas and making sure that we are investing in the areas that make a difference. But we can't give up on the issues around the gender pay gap, or they're only going to get worse. But then if you look at the gender issues in the most disadvantaged groups, so for example, Aboriginal women and domestic and family violence are huge. So we can't just look at the gender issue in isolation from those other issues, such as those most disadvantaged groups and the impact of gender laid on that disadvantage. And we know that we have to start looking at how do we address those issues in the context of the most disadvantaged Australians.
Our survey results showed that ethnicity and language are considered to be the factors on which people are most commonly marginalised. How can we overcome these barriers to reduce inequalities?
Well, for a start, we need a much better dialogue in this country around ethnicity, around our multicultural society, and start valuing and making sure that we're using positive language, that we're valuing our diversity, and that we're working together on these issues. But we also need to realise that we need to be targeting resources into these particular areas and make sure we're doing it on an evidence base. And across all of the goals, I think we need to be making sure that we're using an evidence base for where we are focusing our attention and our resources. We clearly do waste a lot of money on programs in this country, on programs that are ideologically based rather than evidence based, that are short term, that are delivered in the wrong way. And so I'll go back to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and it's very clear from the evidence that the best programs are culturally based programs that are properly funded, that are longer term, and most critically, the decision making is made by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples themselves, and the services are delivered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples themselves. And we still have a long way to go in this in Australia to make sure that we're doing that. Same goes for other communities. We need to make sure that programs are culturally appropriate, and that the people to whom we are applying these programs actually that's not the way it happens, that they are actually driven and owned by the communities themselves.
Regardless of employment status, respondents to our survey rated access to income as the means most necessary to empower the most marginalised groups. How can we ensure that all Australians, regardless of ethnicity, language and location, can generate sustainable income?
Well, for a start here, that takes me to our social safety net, and the fact that we need a strong social safety net. We need a strong social safety net that's fit for the 21st century, and unfortunately at the moment we don't. And if you have to rely on our social safety net in this country, you are living basically below the poverty line. So for a start, we need to increase payments like New Start. But the Greens have a policy that's around guaranteed adequate income. And there's a lot of talk now about whether you call it guaranteed adequate income or universal basic income. I think we need to have a much more rigorous debate about that for a start. So we need to make sure the foundation is there, that we do have a strong social safety net fit for purpose for the 21st century. On top of that, we need to make sure then that we have, to support people into employment, that we have employment services that meet people's needs. And the evidence that I get a lot into my office shows that we don't have that. We're trying to cookie cut services for people trying to find employment. So we need much stronger wraparound services. We need a much stronger education and training system that is fit for purpose, that does actually meet people's needs. So there's a range of things that need to be done, and we need to address issues around inequality, making sure the minimum wage is adequate, making sure that we start addressing issues like inequality. Otherwise we can continue to see people go backwards.
Education was rated as the tool most likely to reduce inequalities and create sustainable change. How can we ensure that everyone has access to quality education?
This is a critical factor, absolutely critical, and that's why we so strongly were supporting the funding investment around Gonski, where we start looking, where we invest where we need it, making sure that everybody can get access to education, which I'd argue in many places we're not. And we also need to meet the needs of people in education. So I'll go back to being asked to address issues around, particularly, for example, around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, making sure that the education system is culturally appropriate, meets their needs. So fundamentally, when an education system that actually meets people's needs, that is accessible so that everybody gets access to a quality, strong education. And that also needs to carry on then into training. And we have fallen down there very substantially in this country in terms of carrying on from the education into vocational training and to higher education, particularly vocational training. We have a long way to go here. The system is stumbling.
Our final question today. Marginalised groups are rarely represented at decision-making levels, particularly within government. How can we ensure that the needs of marginalised groups are represented at all levels of decision-making, particularly through government policy?
Well, this is where government needs to actually be getting out and talking to people. And I'll use one of the examples a classic example I'm working at the moment, and that is the cashless welfare card, where government wants to take a top-down, punitive approach to limiting people's spending ability of their income support payments if you're on a working age payment. Now, the government's trialling this in certain communities and is not talking to the people that it will actually affect. It's also not looking at the evidence base to show it doesn't work. But we need to be making sure that we're having proper consultation, meaningful consultation with people that are affected by the policies. And when, in Northern Territory is another example where they came from punitive top-down approach that did not talk to the communities that would be affected. They didn't talk to leaders in the community about what couldn't, may or may not work, how they go about addressing issues of extreme disadvantage. And so we need to be making sure that there's consultation, meaningful consultation, that it requires listening. Consultation is not talking at people, it's actually talking with people, listening and working out solutions with the people that are affected by their decision making and by their policy.
That's all for today.
My pleasure. I hope that was useful, and I'm happy to talk to anybody anytime if you contact my office.